Welcome back to another episode of the Done Deal Show. I'm live with Ben Jacobs. How are you, my friend?
I'm very well. Happy New Year to those that I haven't wished it to. I know it's not my first time back on the show since the turn of the year, but great to be here as ever.
Absolutely, and lots to delve into today. Of course, we're touching on Weghorst to Man United. That is a done deal. We're very soon to get an official announcement from the football club and taking a look at what else United could be doing. We're going to take a pit stop at Tottenham with their pursuit of Pedro Porro and the potential hijack from Chelsea. Plus, have a look at Harry Kane's new deal and maybe some Qatari investment there. Also going to look at the goings on at Chelsea, which it's been a mad week and a play tonight as well. We're touching base there. And of course, giving you a big update on the mykhaylo Mudryk to Arsenal deal as that moves ever closer. An official update exclusively from Ben. But I wanted to start off with Manchester United because kind of out of, I wouldn't say out of complete obscurity, but it was only 3 or 4 days ago the Weghorst deal kind of reared its head. United have got it done pretty quickly. He's going in. Could you give us a bit of an update on the loan fee, the amount of time, and anything else United could expect to do this window?
So the backstory here is that Manchester United wanted more of a traditional old school forward and target man. That's not to say that they weren't also very seriously looking at Joao, Felix, and we know that they had that admiration and had gone on the player side to try for Cody Gakpo as well, but not to the extent or speed as Liverpool, which is why ultimately Manchester United, who never made a bid, were not able to enter the race in a club-to-club sense for Gakpo. But I think that regardless of those type of players, Erik Ten Hag feels like, in the absence of Cristiano Ronaldo, and very possibly even when he was still at the football club, this more old school, physical, very rigid striker is the kind of part that he needs that is missing in this squad. Because what we see is a lot of pace, a lot of movement, a lot of young talent, a lot of very technical and proficient ball players in the attacking third. And Weghorst offers something that is a little bit more old-fashioned and is able to hold up the ball and let others run through him, get into the box, offer an aerial presence. And I think that when people just look at the name, to some extent, it may be caricatured, and Manchester United fans might feel like it's not a very ambitious signing, and it's also a player age-wise that isn't going to be there for a very long time. But it's a fit. And because Manchester United are playing well, this is not the early part of the season where there's turmoil and there's drama and there's a lack of unity in the dressing room and there's the Cristiano Ronaldo situation to be resolved. This is Manchester United with momentum. So Weghorst isn't somebody that is going to rock the boat. He's not going to divide a dressing room. He's not going to throw his toys out the pram, no doubt, if he's not starting every game. And therefore, should he come in and be a personality fit and a football fit and an option, and I think the best way of putting it is just something that Manchester United don't have, then why can't it work? And Manchester United have had a bit of a habit, haven't they, of going for a slightly older left field signing in the past. And I remember the fan base, even though perhaps these were names with even bigger reputations than Weghorst, but I'm thinking about the likes of mykhaylo when he joined, or Teddy Sheringham even, and in slightly more recent history, a player like Cavani. And all of these signings are slightly older and some would argue past their peak. But in a weird way, they've tended to work for Manchester United. And I think that Weghorst will fall into the same category. So it was a relatively complex deal to do because he's a Burnley player on loan at Besiktas, and Besiktas in that loan have got an option to buy. And therefore, the way the deal worked was that the player agreement between Manchester United was very fast. And you might have noticed that in Weghorst's last game for Besiktas, he ran off, he celebrated, and he seemingly waved goodbye. It was denied by his agent, but it did look like a little wave goodbye. And we've known for a while that Weghorst wanted the opportunity to go to Manchester United. And because he went down with Burnley, still feels that he's got something to prove in the Premier League. But Besiktas had an option to buy. And that complicated things because it wasn't just about Burnley bringing the player back and then negotiating with Manchester United. There was no recall clause, and therefore negotiation was also needed between Besiktas and Burnley. And eventually the three clubs involved have determined that it will be a £2.5 million fee, which will be paid as compensation directly from Manchester United to Besiktas. And then that allows the player to go back to Burnley. Then Manchester United loan him from Burnley until the end of the season. So Weghorst has still got to undertake his medical. And then from Besiktas's point of view, as I reported last week, there's the opportunity, very likely, I would say at the moment, to bring Vincent Aboubakar back, which would be a re-signing for Besiktas. And that, ironically, plays into the whole Ronaldo narrative, of course. So Manchester United can't escape being caught up in that. Ronaldo at Al Nassr, and Al Nassr have sort of filled up all of their foreign slots, and therefore Aboubakar is suddenly surplus to requirements, and as a consequence, Besiktas would quite like him back. There are a few complications because Aboubakar left Besiktas for Al Nassr on a very high pay packet. So he would ideally like wage parity, but he is also aware that Al Nassr are trying to force him out. So there's a couple of options here. First thing to say on Aboubakar, who, let's not forget, scored that brilliant injury time winner against Brazil at the World Cup and then took his shirt off knowing that he would get a second booking and be sent off, but he didn't really care. And there was a fun moment where he sort of smiled at the referee and said, I've just scored an injury time winner. I'll take the sending off. So good form in the World Cup. But option number one is that he is loaned to Besiktas, which might be the only financial way that Besiktas can make it work. Or option number two is that Al Nassr agree to terminate the Aboubakar contract, and in doing so, give him a big payout. And then Aboubakar, as a free agent, might be happy with the financials from that termination and be prepared to go to Besiktas on a lower rate. There is interest from other Turkish clubs, I should add, as well. But that's how the narrative is going to play out. And it's been premature over the last week or so for people to presume he's already a free agent. So I've been told pretty categorically from Al Nassr that talks are ongoing. And as of now, he's still an Al Nassr player. But Besiktas are hopeful that they can replace Weghorst with Aboubakar over the course of the next few days or weeks.
That's a great update. Thank you. And I think on the Weghorst thing, as a Man United fan, I'm so 50-50 on this deal. I kind of get the feeling that it is a Ten Hag signing, but is it the highest level of talent that he would have been? You know, if he had the choice to bring in Harry Kane today, or Vlahovic today, or Sesko today, I think he may have gone for them. But I'm happy with the fact that he's sticking with a particular profile of individual. And I kind of like the idea that Weghorst has got that bit between his teeth to say, listen, I've been fairly successful, a goal in every 3 games everywhere else that I've been. My link-up play is very good. It just didn't work for me at Burnley, but I want to go and prove myself. And even if just for 6 months, this guy comes in, scores a few goals, helps knit things together. And we saw against Charlton the other night. We saw in the FA Cup game as well. We need someone else to rotate in. He may not be the guy that starts the big games, but we need someone else to rotate in because Elanga cannot start as a number 9 again. And that's no disrespect to Elanga, but that definitely needs to happen. Will Man United be looking at any other options this month? Any other loan deals? Any other potential signings, or maybe even exits at the club?
Well, in terms of exits, I still think that Scott McTominay is one to watch. Manchester United's position is very clear, though, that they don't want to let him go. But Newcastle, who haven't been busy in this January window, are still exploring that situation, at least on the player side. It's going to be very difficult, though, to persuade Manchester United. But you can understand from McTominay's perspective, since Casemiro has come in and been world-class, why he might want a little bit more game time. So we're going to have to wait and see on that one. We know that Manchester United would ideally like a right back, even though Dalot is in excellent form. It's still about cover in that area and depth, which is going to be important because we're entering into such a busy period. And it's a stick or twist situation in January, because if you stick with what you've got, you have momentum. And it's the same for Newcastle challenging for the Champions League. But if you twist, then you give yourself options, and providing those options are prepared to be squad players, or from Manchester United's perspective are budget, then they might be able to make things work. And therefore, if they do get any injuries, it becomes a situation where they've got cover. And I still think with Manchester United, as you referenced before, that their best starting 11 and maybe even 15 players at the football club can get them into Champions League. But were they to get an injury list like Chelsea, there's still not quite the depth there in certain positions. And right back is arguably a good example of that. I think the other thing is that off the back of the World Cup, everything that would have been in December before a window and in early January and would start to alleviate in terms of the congestion now is very much still condensed in terms of the fixtures, which is really important to stress, because we are in a January window and the dynamic of the fixtures during the January window have changed. And as a consequence, usually you would get through some, if not all, festive fixtures and be in mid-January and say, okay, we've kind of survived unscathed from an injury perspective, or we're still on good form. We've got the points, we've got the run, we've got the momentum. And therefore, you might choose to have a quieter window. But now I think if you're a club like Manchester United, certainly from Erik ten Hag's perspective anyway, you have to be very wary of the fact that right up until the end of the window, you're playing game after game after game. So you don't necessarily want to close the chapter on this window too early, because you're well aware from Manchester United that you've got a game against Manchester City on Saturday, then 3-4 days later you got to go away at Crystal Palace. You've got Arsenal before the window shuts, which is massive. They've got 2 extra games in the semi-final of the EFL Cup. Of course they want those games, but it adds to the congestion. They're still in the FA Cup against Reading as well. And when you actually look at those cup games, it just emphasises, I think, the situation that Manchester United are in and why they might try and move towards the end of the window. Because if they were out of the FA Cup or the League Cup, and of course both would alleviate it further, then they'd be in a position where they would have that Arsenal game. I think it's on a Sunday, so it would be January the 22nd. And then they would wait until, I believe, February. And that would be a nice little break where they could assess. But instead, it's going to be Nottingham Forest and then Reading and then Nottingham Forest again, all before the window shuts. And as a result, Manchester United might be very wary that depth is going to be needed, because it's suddenly going to be quite a tired squad, because they've had games throughout January every 3 to 5 days. And therefore, I still think that right back is one to watch. And I still think that loan deals are one to watch generally. But let's remember one key thing with Manchester United, which is the Glazers are outgoing, very likely for a full sale and very likely advanced to the point where, if everything goes according to plan, we may well know who the new owner, and yet I suppose we should still say possibly minority investor, but more likely owner, we will know who that is before, I would have thought, the end of the season, even if a deal is not done to the point of them actually being in. And if the Glazers are looking at that, and then if we look at the fact that they didn't move in a club-to-club sense with Cody Gakpo, and then if we think about some other signings that Manchester United are linked with but have never stumped up the cash, I think that that is a clue once again to Erik ten Hag wanting signings in January and the Glazers trying to keep things to a bare minimum.
Yeah, look, I agree with everything you've said. It almost feels, listen, I'm not a United fan that I'm not going to count my eggs before they've hatched, but I would expect Man United to be in the final of the Carabao Cup. I think over 2 legs, we should have enough, even with rotation, to beat Nottingham Forest. And we should progress to the next round of the FA Cup, because Reading shouldn't be knocking us out, which means, in February, you've got more games. But you've got that conundrum, as you say, of the owners selling and not wanting to invest. And Weghorst, great. But one extra body, I think, would just make Man United fans a little bit more comfortable. But we will see what happens in this space. Taking it away from Man United slightly, I wanted to go to London, and I wanted to focus on Spurs first of all, because an interesting report that they've been very, very much linked to Pedro. I think it's Porro, of course. 45 million euro release clause from Sporting. Sporting have said you can have him, but you've got to pay the release clause. Tottenham are deliberating over that. And there's talk, and I've seen people quoting you on this, not you saying it directly, but there is also the potential for Chelsea to come in and hijack this deal. What's the latest surrounding him? Spurs or Chelsea? Where do you think he may end up, Ben?
Well, the difficulty for both clubs is that there's a release clause, and at the moment, Sporting is sticking to that. So it's pay up or shut up, effectively, and 45 million euros is the number. Sometimes clubs take this stance, and then as the window ticks away, if there's player buy-in, they soften a little bit. Even if they don't bend on the number, they might bend on the structure. And we know to some extent that was Chelsea's tactic with Enzo Fernandez, although there's a very different narrative between what Chelsea said they bid and did formally versus what Benfica were expecting in that case. But Pedro Porro is definitely a priority name for Tottenham in particular, and they would love to be able to sign him, but they're reticent about paying the release clause. So there's some legwork to be done to see whether privately Sporting are prepared to bend on triggering that. And then from Chelsea's point of view, I think that they would be more likely to explore the number of 45 million euros, but they would again not want to trigger the release clause and pay it in one lump sum. They would try and establish a structure that's a little bit more preferable. And the difference between the two clubs is that Tottenham have actually actively gone to the player side and discussed prospective terms and got a strong element of buy-in, whereas Chelsea have the player on the radar and we wait and see whether they move. So it could be termed a hijack in some senses, but Tottenham are always going to argue at this point they don't want to pay the release clause, so they're hoping for a lower or a different deal. And from Chelsea's point of view, they haven't really done anything too advanced at this stage, but it's very clear that Chelsea would like to strengthen in that area, and it depends whether they want to move fast and do something in January or wait for either this player or some form of right back or full back into the summer period. And maybe that's where Kyle Walker-Peters, for example, comes into the fray from Chelsea's perspective. I think the other thing to understand about Porro, particularly from Spurs' perspective, is that he is arguably stronger from an attacking point of view than necessarily defensive. That's not to say he's weak or a liability defensively, but he's very dynamic. He's reasonably versatile. He can play right back or right midfield, even should he develop, and loves to get into that area, and also relishes playing in a back three, but can be a bit more disciplined in a back four. So there's the appeal, coupled with the age as well. And if Chelsea were to move, they would obviously have to argue a game plan in the long term, because nobody is unseating Reece James at right back when he's fit. So is there any possibility they can play together? And that's where perhaps the player might develop more into a regular right midfielder and build on his defensive qualities. But obviously this isn't what we've seen traditionally at the moment. He's a right back who likes to bomb forwards. And the areas of development that are needed are defensively. He doesn't really engage in or win that many aerial duels. He gets caught out of position at times, but he's very confident when he's on the ball, and he's actually pretty good under pressure when he's being run at. But he's not always that savvy to quick changes of direction or getting back on the counter-attack. And therefore, if a side like Spurs, for example, wants a disciplined right back that's going to help them not fall behind in games, and we've seen them go on a run that thankfully they ended relatively recently, but they were on that run of 10 consecutive games in all competitions where they conceded first. And when you consider that Tottenham are in the knockout stage of the Champions League, and they're not that far off Champions League football, and they've had this run where they keep handing out lead after lead after lead, if you're Antonio Conte, you're just saying, let's keep clean sheets, let's stop giving away leads. And then Tottenham are going to surge up the table and stand a very good chance of going far in the Champions League. And this is why they're looking at defensive reinforcement. So I think that Pedro Porro is one to watch, in the sense that the Tottenham interest is serious and active, at least in a club to player sense. But if Sporting hold out for the release clause or nothing stance, then it's going to be very difficult for Tottenham, because their position, and it's hard to see that changing in the next 2 weeks, has always been that they don't want to just trigger the release clause. And if they did, they could do that very quickly and very easily, but they haven't to date.
Yeah, Spurs are an interesting one in this, in the sense of, I saw a journalist, I want to say it was Alistair Gold last night, say that there are reports from other agents that Pedro Porro could be a smokescreen for another signing. And I just saw the Spurs fans essentially react with, that's code for we're not willing to pay the price, and we've started looking for other people. And I think that where I would be worried as a Spurs fan is that you're playing poorly and need new players. But at the same time, last year you missed out on. You ended up with Bentancur and Kulusevski that have done well, but you missed out on primary targets for the manager because you dilly-dallied over the price. If they would have just got it done early with Luis Diaz as an example, they would have got him in sooner. Now, Spurs fans might not want to swap Kulusevski with him and go, actually, it's okay, we'll take our time. But I can certainly see a certain amount of frustration creeping in with Tottenham fans right now. Where they're not frustrated, though, Ben, is some news that you broke exclusively to the world of football. I mean, I know everyone knows this is going on, but the potential investment from Qatar into Tottenham, I mean, how likely is this?
Well, I think when you say Tottenham are dilly-dallying over prices or deals, the accurate way of expanding on that is that Daniel Levy has always been very cautious with investment, and Tottenham's last window was very un-Levy-like. He invested extra money into the football club after Champions League qualification, and Antonio Conte had a lot of control over that summer window. Perisic, for example, in terms of the age and the profile, was a very un-Spurs-like signing, but very much somebody that Conte wanted. And I think Antonio Conte has got more control over transfers than any previous Spurs manager under Daniel Levy. But that doesn't mean that he can ask for unlimited funds. And my feeling with Tottenham coming onto the investment side is that Daniel Levy is prepared to surrender a minority stake at the football club and is in active discussions with multiple suitors, potentially. This is the feeling within the industry, speaking to sources over the last week or so. But Daniel Levy doesn't want an outgoing plan. He wants business as usual, but with more investment coming into the club. So it's about finding the right minority stake partner. Now, before I go into QSI, we have to be very balanced about the situation and respectful to Tottenham and say that the club categorically deny that any meetings have taken place regarding the equity of the football club. And I stressed that in my exclusive as well. But of course, there's two sides to every story, and sources have made it abundantly clear. And I think there's very much consensus now across the media that QSI and Nasser Al-Khelaifi, who is the chairman of QSI, Qatar Sports Investments, and he's also the president of PSG, who are the flagship crown jewel at the moment within the QSI portfolio. Al-Khelaifi met with Daniel Levy, and he did so this year, last week, and it is not the first meeting between the two. Now, from Tottenham's perspective, not only do they deny this, but they add, and there's a slight conflict here, that the two are friends, and maybe they were discussing ECA business, and you have to start building as a journalist through multiple sources a narrative to determine exactly what has happened. Because if they didn't meet, then why would the narrative shift to their friends and maybe they did meet, but they were discussing other things? And that's when you have to dig a little further. But again, I'll say it for a second time. Tottenham deny that any equity about the football club was spoken about. Other sources close to QSI tell a very different story, and they state that possible investment was a topic discussed, and they add that Daniel Levy might be open to selling up to 30% of the football club. QSI more broadly want to add a Premier League club to their portfolio, and it probably wouldn't be 30% because that's quite large and would require, at Spurs, an investment of over £1 billion. But they are looking at 15 to 25% at a lot of their clubs that they may add in 2023. And people maybe think that QSI are a bit like the City Football Group, but they're really not. The City Football Group are a multi-club model, very much with a view to Manchester City and pathways. They're very football focused, and they've got multiple clubs strategically placed all around the world. Qatar Sports Investments have got PSG and Braga. That's it. And even Braga's a new acquisition. Some people keep mentioning Eupen in Belgium, but there's no direct affiliation between QSI and Eupen. And when QSI invested 23% almost in Braga, they didn't necessarily do so with a view to PSG. They did an investment in the context of the QSI strategy, which is partly financial return. And if you look at Braga's share price since that investment, it's skyrocketed. But also there's wider aims here. QSI post-World Cup have a sports strategy that will extend up for now anyway until 2030. And it is about the growth of sport in Qatar. It is about brand recognition. It is about generating money away from the world of gas and oil. And it's about promoting tourism in Qatar. Whereas PSG, even though they play into that, are more about success for PSG. So investing in Tottenham for QSI wouldn't be a conflict with PSG. And it wouldn't necessarily be about creating football relationships. It's more about QSI building a sports brand for much more wider strategic goals. And therefore, the fit with Spurs is the fact that QSI are not as interested as others in being hands-on day-to-day, making football decisions, because their focus is PSG and they want to try and develop PSG, win the Champions League with PSG. And that's good for Daniel Levy because it was a minority investor to come in. It becomes about that dynamic whereby Levy can have the control over the club and business as usual, but welcome strategic funding. And ironically, this is exactly what PSG are doing. They're going to sell between 5 and 15% of PSG by the second quarter of 2023. And there's 3 suitors. One of them is in advanced talks in an exclusive period of due diligence. 2 of the 3 groups that have made offers are American, and PSG will sell a stake between 5 and 15%. The reason why I give you that sliding scale is because each group has made a different offer, and all of them value the club at over $4 billion. So for PSG, when you consider what they paid for the football club, it's an amazing bit of business that still gives them the control and still allows them to be fully committed in the football club, but welcome some funding. And we might even see Liverpool do this as well. So this is about money rather than control, if anything comes of it. And I should just stress on the Spurs and Al Khalifi QSI meeting that these are formative talks. These are exploratory and these are early stage. So we need to wait and see how they develop. Nothing is guaranteed. And QSI are looking at lots of options in the Premier League, but also beyond and in South America as well. The only thing in terms of specifics of those other clubs that I can tell you is that, contrary to some reports, there has been no contact between QSI and Liverpool or contact between QSI and Manchester United. But historically, QSI have looked at Leeds. There's nothing in that at the moment. So Spurs are the first club they've met with. It's exploratory, it's formative. We wait and see how it develops. And once again, Spurs deny this, which either means they're denying it because it's common sense to do so until anything is advanced or concrete, or they're denying it because they're talking to lots of different suitors at the moment and they don't want it out there, or they're denying it because they genuinely believe that there's nothing in this. And again, we have to wait and see how this develops. But with this type of investment, we need to be very cautious and very balanced, because it's very easy as a journalist to just put a name out there and get that glory of a headline. But you have to be extremely balanced and quantitative with how you express the situation, and it may develop, because it's not like a transfer where you want something, you can get something, and then you complete the deal. It takes time, it takes due diligence, it takes a variety of different parties, and whilst it's still exploratory, the situation can move in a number of different directions.
Totally get and understand that, and I think it's fans always get giddy. I did see Spurs fans sort of talking like, "Wow, we're going to get this investment. What a big January!" And I did sort of sit there and think, yeah, slow down a little bit, maybe, in relation to that. Viewers, make sure like buttons are being smashed and you're subscribing. I want to, we've kind of briefly touched on Chelsea. We know Joao Felix is in. We've seen him today. The videos of him saying their gym's bigger. Looks relatively happy to be at Chelsea. But we also know they're looking at other players, and other names that are being linked to them are the likes of Marcus Thuram. There's still talk of the Enzo Fernandez deal being on. Caicedo maybe. What else is going on at Chelsea, and can we expect more business from? Well, I would say from Todd Boehly. He's relinquished the title, as it were. But can we expect more business from Chelsea on a transfer front, Ben?
Chelsea, I think, are going to be busy until the final seconds of the window, both in terms of internal incomings and outgoings as well. And this tells you that they're trying to back Graham Potter as best they can. And there's full patience in him at the moment. I think that Fulham is important to stop the rot, if you like, although they did beat Bournemouth prior to that poor draw against Nottingham Forest as well. And then the losses to Manchester City in the Cup and also in the league were not ideal. But the oddity of all of that is that the league performance was actually okay. It was a young, hungry side, and there were plenty of positives in that. Whereas I think the Cup defeat to Manchester City was dreadful because there was no identity. And I think that we can debate with Chelsea the injuries. We can point to the fact that the club is behind their rivals in windows due to the uncertainty of the sale and the sanctions and Roman Abramovich's departure. And fans perhaps don't realise that because they see a new ownership group with their checkbook out and they think, why are we not winning races? And it's because the elite race for top players requires time. So if your club is uncertain, if your ownership is uncertain, if there are sanctions and if there is managerial change, it sets you back. And this, for context, is also why the ownership group won't want to get rid of Graham Potter, because they don't want to be seen as cutthroat. And he's deemed to be not just the right fit from a coaching point of view, but also strategically within the new model that's building and as a personality. And if they change the manager again, then they'll have had two managers in 6 months and two managers over 2 windows. So then imagine if you're talking to summer targets, they'll say, who am I going to be playing over when the summer comes along? And how do I know that you're not going to keep adding players and making upheaval behind the scenes? And that lack of stability can work against you at times. So Chelsea, I sense, will stick with what they've got now and try and build. So I mentioned those 3 areas, and just briefly, I'll go into them. The internal first, which is about the renewal of contracts. And there is high confidence that a Mason Mount deal will happen. There is growing confidence that N'Golo Kante will sign. And with that one, it's been about Chelsea not wanting to set a precedent of an older player on big wages and a long-term contract. And I think that because N'Golo Kante really loves Chelsea and would like to stay in London, this one is now moving in the right direction. And it's basically been about Chelsea wanting less wage and also a shorter contract length. And N'Golo Kante originally knowing on a free transfer, he can get the wage and the contract somewhere else, trying to leverage that to get a longer deal at Chelsea. And it wouldn't at all surprise me if a compromise is a club option to extend, which maybe compromises on the length of the contract, but at the club's discretion. And therefore, N'Golo Kante can't have an option to extend, but the club can, giving Chelsea that dual ability to keep it short or extend it, depending on circumstances, because you never know how a player is going to develop once they start to creep into their early and mid-30s. So that's the Kante situation. I think we're going to get movement on Mount sooner rather than later. And then Jorginho is probably the one that Chelsea feel is the most likely of those 3 names to exit at this stage. And there is still some interest from Juventus and Newcastle as well are looking to some extent. And I think that with Jorginho, much like Hakim Ziyech, the concern for Newcastle is around wages. And therein is the challenge for Newcastle, because until they get Champions League football, they don't necessarily want to bring in a name that is on sky-high wages. First of all, because it sets a bad precedent. And second of all, because it can rock your dressing room a little bit. Imagine if everyone that's got Newcastle so far sees mid-season players like a Jorginho or a Ziyech come in, and they're on 60,000 more than anyone else in the Newcastle United dressing room. Then every single player, if they qualify for Champions League, is going to be asking for a 60,000 or a ratioed percentage increase to get to a parity of that. And it can feel counterproductive to your unity and your momentum, because these players know exactly what their teammates are earning. So that's just something to bear in mind. Then with the incomings, Felix is in. It is a straight loan, as I revealed a few weeks back. And as I told you in December, Chelsea were always seriously considering Felix, but the value had to be right. So they looked at other options, and then they came back to the situation after the 2 defeats to Manchester City because they felt like it was an investment worth making. Whereas Arsenal and Manchester United have never been prepared to pay a loan fee in excess of £9 million. And the other thing which is challenging now with Felix is if it all works out, because there's perhaps a sense at the Atleti end that Felix might outlast Simeone. With his contract now extended until 2027, are Atleti going to be prepared if Chelsea want Felix to negotiate on a permanent deal? And that remains to be seen, because you can argue it two ways, and it's not me sitting on the fence. We don't know yet. Extending the contract can just protect the value. So then if Atleti are bracing themselves for a sale after this, they now know with that extra year that not only can they add one more year if they keep him to their book declaration under financial fair play, but they can also set the price as high as they like because there's another year on the contract. Similarly, you could say because they've extended it, it opens the door to a negotiation because Atleti now believe that they don't have to cave to a cut price sale. And if it works out at Chelsea, they'll be in a very strong position because both clubs will want it to happen. So we have to wait and see on that. But I think that it's a good signing for Chelsea. And I'm intrigued now to look at whether, and we might see a clue even this evening against Fulham, it's Felix or Havertz, or alternatively, it's Felix and Havertz. And if it's both, then Chelsea maybe have got a few more weapons in trying to score more goals in games. And obviously that signing isn't great value, but I think for Chelsea, it's not only about value in terms of monetary value, it's value on the football side because they need an urgent fix. And if Felix provides that, people will stop talking about just how much money they've spent on a very short-term fix. Thuram is possible, but I think it's very important to note that Chelsea's tactic may be to move in January and try and agree a fee, but there's loads of other suitors that are just waiting and trying to get him on a free transfer. And I've still not heard anything yet to suggest that Thuram is leaning towards a mid-season move. So Chelsea have got some work to do on that front to not only strike a deal if it advances to that point, but also persuade the player. Then I think it's worth pointing out the Aubamyang situation, and he can't go to any other club mid-season other than Barcelona. And Barcelona would like to bring him back, but only under very specific financial conditions. And given that Chelsea paid a fair amount of money to get that deal done right towards the end of the window because Thomas Tuchel wanted it, it will be bad business for Chelsea to return him back to Barcelona on very weak terms. So that one, I think, might have substance to it from the player's perspective because he's not really settled or happy at Chelsea. But I think that they might hang on to any goal-scoring weapons mid-season until they bring somebody in. So any Aubameyang exit, and it could only be mid-season to Barcelona, might be contingent on somebody else coming in. So yeah, don't rule out a loan. And then the other thing I would add is don't obviously rule out a midfielder. Enzo Fernandez is stalled for now. We wait and see. Benfica are adamant it's release clause or nothing. And Chelsea argue that their offer was nowhere near the release clause, contrary to some reports. So there's two narratives from the clubs. They're very different. And we're going to have to wait now and see if Chelsea move. Moises Caicedo, as I reported first a few weeks ago, is on Chelsea's radar. Liverpool like the player too. A deal has been messy in the past due to multiple agent representation, hidden costs and side fees. And therefore, we now need to wait a week because the new agent of Moises Caicedo doesn't formally represent him until January the 18th. And then there's going to be a mad scramble to see whether anything is possible in January. Otherwise, clubs will look to the summer. And I think that Chelsea are the more likely compared to Liverpool to try something in January, but the fee will be in excess of £70 million all in all likelihood. And Brighton are not under any pressure to sell. So when I spoke to their CEO exclusively for CBS, Paul Barber, he made it clear that they're not planning for anything in January, incoming or outgoing at the moment, and they believe it to be a seller's market. So therefore, if Chelsea come calling, it will be the same kind of high price as when that Marc Cucurella deal got done. But I think the difference between Caicedo and Alexis McAllister is that the Caicedo interest is far more historical from a number of clubs, whereas the McAllister interest has circled post-World Cup. And a club like Chelsea value McAllister at 30 million, but Brighton want 60 plus million. Whereas with Caicedo, the valuation on him last summer was actually more around 45 or 50 million, which means clubs may feel like maybe we can get Brighton down to 65, and suddenly there's not as big a difference there comparative to McAllister, and McAllister's contracted until 2025 with a club option to automatically extend. So Brighton are in quite a safe position with him. So Caicedo, I feel, is the one to watch. McAllister is on a lot of clubs' radars too. And then Edson Álvarez could still be bubbling there in the background because Chelsea wanted him at the back of the last window, but Ajax were not prepared to sell. And with that one, similar situation. Are Ajax prepared to sell mid-season? The price last summer was around 45 million euros, and the player wanted the move to Chelsea. But it's all very well having player buy-in, but if the club is not prepared to negotiate mid-season, you don't have time in a January window to get that type of deal done. But watch Chelsea right up until the last seconds of the window, because I still think there's a strong possibility that one or two more senior players come in.
Yeah, it's as you say, there's so much going on at Chelsea. It feels I don't like using the word mess, but I understand why certain people do, because there's such a clamor for new signings. But I think your earlier point is so important around sticking with Graham Potter. The message it sends to that dressing room, and even the message it sends to players that are coming in now and agreeing to join, depending on who the new manager is, could change how they feel about being at the club. You've only got to look at Aubameyang as an example. He came partly for Chelsea, but I think more so because he knew and trusted Tuchel. And then suddenly Tuchel's gone. So you have a situation where Aubameyang's probably thinking, I didn't want to be here for really any other reason than to play for a manager that trusts me right now. So especially after he got his dream move to Barcelona and it ended after 6 months. So they've got to be very, very careful, more so with the manager than I think new players coming in. But viewers, what do you think and what do you feel? We're going to be moving on to Arsenal very, very shortly, but a few super chats before that. The first one says, morning, gents. Question for Mr. Jacobs. Is there any truth in the, I think it's pronounced, is it Koppmeiners rumor to Liverpool? God knows we need a midfielder.
Yeah, Liverpool do need a midfielder, but they're not just going to move for the sake of it. And there is a balance between what they can get now in January versus the summer. And I think what has fueled this is that, from what I understand, the player himself has said that the link with Liverpool is, quote, nice to see, although he added that he's 100% focused with Atalanta. And a player can be flattered and fuel something, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's leading to something imminently. So what we know, or certainly I know from talking to sources, is that the 24-year-old has been scouted before the World Cup, and that may be with a view to an escalated winter move, but the original scouting was an option for the summer. So I think that the chances of getting him to Anfield are going to be relatively slim. And that's because at the Atlanta end, they're quite categorical, both on and off record through a variety of different sources, in saying that a mid-season sale is off the table. So I think that the key thing here is, again, about admiration not leading to advanced. And that's maybe where some fans get a little bit over excited. Right now, there's nothing concrete on the Liverpool side. And I would be staggered if he moves in January, because Atlanta are pretty firm in their position. So I think that when we define substance, it's very key to explain what that means. And substance can be because a player is on a shortlist or has been scouted, and that's normal. And a scout will look at hundreds of players, not only because they want the player, but as I've said many times on this show, as yardsticks, because you want different players of similar ages or similar positions to choose between, but also leverage against. Because if you know that one's available in the market and you've got no interest in them, but your rival quite likes them, you might go and look at them or scout them or pull data on them, because you can use that profile as a yardstick for price and within negotiation. In this case, yes, Liverpool have watched the player, but they haven't made an approach. They haven't made an offer. And Atalanta say very clearly that there'll be no January move. So other than the player himself somewhat fueling this, I don't think that there's any possibility of movement in January. And then in the summer, we wait and see, because Liverpool have got a variety of options. If Caicedo's there and available in the summer, you still can't rule that out, even though Liverpool have not placed a bid to date. And we know that Liverpool are in the race for Jude Bellingham as well. And I think Liverpool, more than anybody, don't allocate X amount of positions to be strengthened and then desperately chase after each of those positions. They trust in what they've got, and they know that they're not going to be able to spend what Manchester City spend. So therefore, if they get a target at a high number, Gakpo and maybe Bellingham in the summer, it restricts their ability to get another target in another position. Yeah. So you might hear of 2 high-value targets for Liverpool in completely different positions now, and they might want both of them desperately, and they might take that race right to the end, and they might know that they can get both. But financially, at least until any new investment comes in, they may choose or be forced to only get one. And I think that's the difference between a Liverpool and a Manchester City. So it's really important to stress that as well, that with the success in one target, like Gakpo, becomes a realignment in what is or isn't feasible for a club like Liverpool at the moment.
That makes total sense. Anthony here says, broke United say wait until the summer. Who are the new owners? Well, we don't know who the new owners are yet. There's rumors every day, but nothing substantial at that point. Thank you for the super chat. Ben, Arsenal, there are questions about a few other players linked to Arsenal that we'll go on to a bit later. But of course, you tweeted yesterday, or I've seen people tweet out your information that Arsenal and Shakhtar Donetsk could be getting closer to sealing a full agreement on mykhaylo Mudryk with an agreed fee around 50 to 60 million euros. We know the second bid was rejected. How soon do you think until a third bid is submitted and this deal sort of progresses towards completion?
Well, from sources I've spoken to at both clubs, the second bid rejection, if you like, is much more of a grey area. That's not to say that it has or will be accepted, but the way that a January window works, as soon as you've placed multiple bids, is that you don't want to formally reject and then just walk away, because both buyer and seller are prepared to get this done. So through intermediaries and now direct club talks, and quite regular as well, you're taking the skeleton of that second bid and you're building upon it. So I would be hesitant to say an outright rejection took place of the second bid. I think Shakhtar turned it down in principle, but in practice, verbal back and forth is building upon that second bid to see whether a deal can get done. And Arsenal don't want to pay 100 million euros, and Shakhtar publicly say they want 100 million euros, but I'll say it again. And I know that we sound like broken records, but it's important to be accurate at the time we're recording and not jump the gun here. Arsenal don't see the number as important as the structure. And the reason for that, as I've explained many times, is 100 million means nothing whatsoever if most of that 100 million is unattainable or unlikely or a risk for Shakhtar. They would much rather take a lower number where the add-ons are highly likely and there is still a healthy guaranteed fee in a payment structure that suits them. So these are the kind of conversations taking place. And there's definitely more of a consensus now over the guaranteed fee. And I've said many times that at the lower end, 50 million euros, and at the higher end, 60 million euros is the kind of ballpark. But Arsenal have been very deliberate in going up in small incrementals. So when perhaps on Monday or Tuesday, there were some reports out there saying it was a done deal and it was going to be close to 100 million, everyone gets excited about that, but there's red flags there all over. No club in their right mind, especially not one who negotiate like Arsenal, would jump from under 70 million euros to 100 million euros. That's not how any negotiation works. Incrementals that clubs go up in, verbally or formally, are always much smaller than that. Otherwise, you're in such a weak position. Imagine what Shakhtar would think if Arsenal jumped from just under 70 million euros to 100 million euros in the space of a few days. That's just not how deals get done.
Well, they might push the price up further because you've shown weakness in those conversations and a bit of desperation. So, yeah,
Exactly.
no, I totally agree.
And the approach from Arsenal has always been the same: to ignore the noise, to stick to their own top-end valuation, and to not get sucked into any rumoured interest by Chelsea. And we know there was some substance in the sense that the Shakhtar delegation met with Todd Boehly and also went to Stamford Bridge, but Chelsea have not made an offer for McKaylo Mudryk. So Arsenal are the club in direct and near daily talks with Shakhtar. Instead of obsessing about when it's going to get done, a reminder, the January window's only got a few weeks left. So there isn't any need to stress over exactly when it's going to get done. As long as the clubs remain in talks, Arsenal remain optimistic. And I think that Shakhtar is a typical club to deal with. That's the other thing to stress. And to try and explain what that means, they, with every player, do business in an unorthodox way. Their president is heavily involved, and those who negotiate with Shakhtar often employ local knowledge and intermediaries, because that's how you get a deal done. They don't see themselves as a selling club, regardless of the war in Ukraine, regardless of the fact that they've lost some players as a result of that. They categorically do not see themselves as a selling club, and they feel like Mudryk's value won't be too different in the summer. So all of that, and the amount of voices involved, both formally and informally, leads to challenges. And this is why Arsenal are glad that they now can have more of a direct involvement. The intermediaries do the legwork and all the bits in between, but Arsenal are actively now in regular contact with Shakhtar. So, as I've said before, the feeling at the Arsenal end remains it will not be a 100 million euro deal, and that as time ticks away, the value will drop. So part of this is not necessarily a stalemate. It can also be about Arsenal intentionally waiting, because they do sense that Shakhtar will sell this window, and they're letting time tick further and further away, because that's what's going to get them within their number. And then as time runs out, do Arsenal have to bend a little bit? Or are Shakhtar going to finally accept that with a healthy guaranteed fee and more gettable add-ons, a deal will get done? And at the moment, it is about the structure. And if the two clubs can agree upon that, with a bit more now consensus over the guaranteed fee, then a deal will get done. We know Mudryk wants the move. We know he's dropping clues on social media, but he's at the training camp in Turkey, and he's acting like it's business as usual at the moment, because he's very respectful of the club. And that's the last point that I'll make on this, that what you see on social media is not too reflective of Mudryk's personality. Having spoken to him before, Mudryk is quite shy, quite humble, and very much focused on football and being that brand. He sees himself, if he succeeds, as not only being an elite level footballer, but very much carrying a brand. And that brand is about humility. That brand is about direct engagement with young audiences. That brand is about doing socially conscious things, of which he's been involved in during the war in Ukraine as well. And as a consequence, that respect for Shakhtar is key here. This is not Wesley Fofana and Leicester as the window ticks away, where the player throws a strop, where the player refuses to play. He's a very grounded human being. So the clues on social media are significant. Everyone knows he wants the move. But he's also aware, as he said to me in conversations, which you can see on the CBS website and also on TikTok and social media, very clear. It's not only my decision. And he said, in winter, we'll see. And when expanded on that, he said, I can't say no to Arsenal, but it's up to Dario Serna, the sporting director. It's up to the board. It's up to the president. And everybody will have to allow for a move or I won't go. And I think that's the point here, that he's very appreciative of what Shakhtar have done for him. He's very proudly Ukrainian, and he's got a very tight-knit bond with his teammates. So he doesn't want to leave in acrimony, which is why I think he's resorting to social media to drop hints, because if he does anything else, it can unsettle the dressing room. So optimistic from Arsenal's point of view, confident, I would say, but it may need a bit more time, which is why, unlike others, I'm not prepared at this stage to slap a specific deadline on it, because I believe that that would effectively be guesswork. And you can be too irresponsible as a journalist at times when you're looking for clicks, when you're looking at headlines. It doesn't make the blindest bit of difference if it's done today, tomorrow, or next week. As long as Arsenal remain at the table, and each time they remain at the table, they make progress, the deal will get done. And right now, progress number one, more consensus over guaranteed fee. Progress number two, a feeling from all parties that a deal will be reached before the window shuts. Progress number three will be about how much the add-ons are and whether they're gettable. And then, of course, progress number four will be a verbal agreement. And because there's only 2 weeks left in the window, we just have to let the days tick by until that materializes. But I'll say what I've said before on this, which is if it gets to the point where Shakhtar are bullish and say it is still 100 million or nothing, and everything has to be gettable, then Arsenal will just walk away. They do not want to do this deal for 100 million euros.
I was taking a note of that. Listen, a great comprehensive breakdown. I think that's something that Arsenal fans need to hear, because, of course, on the terrace, what we do is we will share what journalists are saying each day and kind of break down their views and opinions. And this isn't to blow smoke up Ben's backside, but one of the reasons why we have Ben, one of the reasons why we have Dean on the show is because when it comes to actually talking to you, you break it down in its entirety from front to back. Quite often with what a lot of journalists say, even when you read their articles, it's a little bit, everything's open to interpretation. And for fans, it's one of the reasons why I started doing transfer talk on the terrace, because sometimes you can read a transfer. I know you've done this and seen this. You can read a transfer article from a credible journalist, and there might be 3 or 4 sentences of new information, and the rest of the article is just a reiteration of information that we already knew. So you kind of look at it as fan, like, okay, well, you're suggesting the deal's close, or you're saying the deal is done. As you say, we saw on Monday reports that the deal was done. So we'll report on that, show the viewers the content that's been put out by a journalist, and then allow the audience to have their say and determine what they think or feel about it. And everything you've said, I get, understand, and agree with it from the way you're interpreting Arsenal's approach. They've just got to be careful here with this deal. The player is proud to be Ukrainian. He's proud. He's happy with what Shakhtar have done for him, and with everything going on with that nation, I think he probably looks at it almost like that's probably another reason why he doesn't want to do things in a sour way, because there's so much. Yeah, and you'll probably find the majority of his teammates and his fellow countrymen are buzzing at the idea that he's going to Arsenal, because it's more money than Shakhtar can pay him, more fame, more fortune, and hopefully they can develop him, which will help their national team. So there's probably a push for it. But as you say, at the right price. We all know clubs like Shakhtar have lost money because of what's going on in their nation. So for them to get the maximum amount of money possible is going to be very, very key. Very, very, very key indeed to sort of everything that's kind of progressing there. But I also get Arsenal fans' frustration, because they wanted this deal done first week of January. What I would say to Gooners is, it's not like you've done okay so far without him. And I think you will persist to. In terms of Arsenal, what other players could you see coming in? There's talks about Milinkovic-Savic being linked to them, and midfield players especially. What's your understanding there?
I think Milinkovic-Savic has been on Arsenal and a number of clubs' radars for quite some time, but the challenge remains that Lazio have always been very reluctant to sell, and the quoted fee has been quite high. So I still think that's one to watch as far as the summer is concerned, rather than necessarily in January, although the only caveat to that is a possible approach of a loan with a relatively large fee, with an option or an obligation to buy in the summer. But Lazio would love to hang on to the player in the January window, and we wait and see whether Arsenal are able to change that. I'd be surprised, not impossible, but surprised if a permanent transfer in January was possible. But I don't think that a loan is unthinkable, except for the fact that time is ticking away and Lazio's position hasn't hugely changed, which is that a mid-season departure isn't ideal. 27-year-old, I think, has got 5 goals and 7 assists, though, in 22 appearances this season. So you can understand why that kind of attacking threat might be something that Arsenal would want to pursue. And there's plenty of other interest as well. I don't think there's too much in the Chelsea sense at this point. They've got other midfielders that I outlined before. Manchester United have looked at the player, but they're not going to be able to move in January. And let's just say, hypothetically, if a loan did materialise, then Manchester United didn't want to pay the 9+ million for Joao Felix. So I don't see them moving for somebody like Milinkovic-Savic at that rate either. But there's plenty of interest there. So it's one to watch, I suppose, but I still think that he'll be available this summer in the market rather than in January. But a loan can obviously change things to some extent. But any club interested in Milinkovic-Savic would have to move fast. There's nothing really in the Danilo Arsenal links. There hasn't been for quite some time. So I think with that one, people are reporting it now as if Nottingham Forest are trying to get Danilo at the expense of Arsenal, but Arsenal haven't come in for Danilo. They've made a decision not to, and for quite some time. So that's not really a race between those two clubs. Yeah. That's Nottingham Forest exploring that possibility now. And then, of course, Youri Tielemans remains a possibility for Arsenal. Preference would be to explore it on a free transfer in the summer. But if another club like Newcastle makes a bid to Leicester in January, we'd have to wait and see how Arsenal might react. But Leicester's perspective with both James Maddison and with Youri Tielemans is that they would prefer to keep them until the end of the season, even if that means losing Tielemans on a free. With Maddison, it's a bit different because obviously if someone made a sky-high bid, then Brendan Rodgers' desire to keep him versus the board's consideration of that offer might be a bit different. But I think the thing with Tielemans, if he's not going to sign, how much money are Leicester going to get in January? And if it's not a huge amount, then they might decide it's more valuable to the football club trying to get clear of relegation to keep Tielemans come what may until the end of the season. So I think that we know Arsenal want to move in that midfield area, but it remains to be seen whether that's now or in the summer. It just depends on which of these targets become genuinely available in the short term versus the long-term strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's another player that I saw linked with Arsenal today. I was reading an article and in your message to me before we went live, and I want to pronounce his name right, Ndicka. I've heard him linked to a number of teams, Arsenal being one, West Ham being another name that I've seen, just in terms of the media saying he's linked to. Is that a possibility for Arsenal, or is that more likely to be a different Premier League club?
No, I mean, this is a player that is hotly being pursued and will be tremendous value in the summer, assuming that no new contract is agreed with Eintracht Frankfurt. And there's a mad chase on all across Europe for the 23-year-old. Arsenal, Manchester United, Chelsea potentially, even with the arrival of Badiashile, and of course Wesley Fofana as well. Liverpool have kept an eye on him, and then a whole variety of others all across Europe. Paris Saint-Germain is another option too, and the players played in France before with Auxerre. That was the club that he left to join Eintracht Frankfurt. Top player, excellent value, 6'4", modern defender, great season so far for Eintracht Frankfurt. And even though he's not done it once this season based on last season, can chip in with goals as well. He scored 4 goals in the Bundesliga in 2021-2022. And there's 2 things to quickly say here. Number one is that we have to bear in mind that a summer move is going to be absolutely a mad dash if the player's available on a free transfer. And then the second thing to bear in mind is that naturally anything would be complicated should a new deal be signed. But at the moment, the feeling is that the player is very seriously available on a free transfer. Nothing has been pre-agreed with Arsenal. That's the other thing, just to quickly say that there are some reports out there that suggest that Arsenal have already pre-agreed a deal and therefore believe that the player wants to move to them. That is not my understanding. My understanding is that Ndicka has not signed anything with any club at this point, and therefore the race is very open for him.
There we go. Thank you. Another player I wanted to ask you about was McAllister. Obviously, he's won the World Cup. He's done very well this season at Brighton. And I know a lot of the big boys in the Premier League, and I'm sure some European counterparts have also been linked with him. Do you see any movement? Probably not in January, but do you see any movement with him across the Premier League, or is he more likely to stay at Brighton?
Well, I think with Alexis McAllister, and apologies, my camera seems to have turned off, but some would say it would be better without seeing the face. So maybe this is an improvement towards the end of the show, but we'll try and get it back on in a second. So as I say, maybe this is better. So with Alexis McAllister, as I revealed when I spoke to Paul Barber, who is the Brighton CEO, the feeling is that there will be a post-World Cup surge, and within that post-World Cup surge, the price will increase significantly. There we go, I'm back, and apologies for the brief disappearance. But Alexis McAllister in demand, but as I said before, one very important thing to note is he's contracted to Brighton until 2025, and there's a club option to automatically extend, which means from the perspective of a transfer now, they can almost value him as if he's at the club until 2026. Now, teams that have looked at McAllister, because even before the World Cup, he was having an excellent season with Brighton, were only really valuing him around 30 million. And now the price that Brighton would be looking for could well be in excess of 60 million pounds. So there's a big jump there. And that allows Brighton to either price him out the market or get an insane amount of money now because of the excellent World Cup that he had. And that is going to put off suitors, which is why I think Caicedo will be a more likely January departure. But I preface that likely comparatively. Neither exit in January is guaranteed. But the difference perhaps with Brighton compared to other clubs is they understand the player desire to take up a challenge. So should an offer come in, and there's been no formal bids for either player at the moment, but if a late offer in the window comes in, then Brighton will understand that situation. So it's going to be about agreeing a price that suits Brighton, and therefore for both players, Caicedo and McAllister, somebody's going to have to pay above the odds. They're not going to let both go either. So that is worth noting, that if someone comes in for Caicedo first and agrees a deal, then anyone chasing after McAllister is going to take a hit, and vice versa. Brighton are not going to, considering they're in the race for European football, let both go in a January window, and they've obviously got to be able to replace those players as well. So if you look at Cucurella, why did they let him go? First of all, because Chelsea offered 62 million all in if everything is met. And second of all, because Estupiñán had come in and has done excellent, by the way. So they had a replacement there, and then they let Cucurella go. Whereas in January, it's very different because they don't have somebody that they've signed yet to replace either of those two players. And McAllister's chipping in with so much, and Caicedo's growing from strength to strength. So I think that that's worth bearing in mind. But again, with McAllister, I think if we're talking comparatively, less likely than Caicedo, because Caicedo's got a new agent who becomes active on January the 18th, which means that after January the 18th, that agent's got 2 weeks to prove their worth. Whereas with McAllister, he only signed a new deal before the World Cup and has said repeatedly on record he's in no rush to leave. So I think that when we look at McAllister, a club's going to have to pay significantly above his market value. Whereas if we look at Caicedo, because most accepted over the summer that 45 or 50 million was something they were prepared to pay, if that goes up to 60, 65, then of course it's more, but it's 10 or 15 million more. And that's normal within a negotiation. And who knows, Brighton might meet somebody halfway if the structure's right. Whereas if you valued McAllister at 25 to 30 million and it's suddenly 65 million, then that's a much higher hike in market value. And that, I think, is what might put off suitors. So Chelsea have both on their radar, but it's quite a long list of midfielders. And that's illustrated by the fact that They went for Enzo Fernandez. They will be in the conversation for Declan Rice. They're not front runners, but Jude Bellingham will be a player that they explore in some capacity. Edson Álvarez was somebody that they bid for at the end of the last window. So if you add Caicedo and McAllister, that tells you the targets, but obviously at best they're going to succeed in getting 2 of them. So I don't think that we should over obsess on the McAllister front with only 3 weeks left in January, a player a lot of clubs may hold talks with and will proceed on with a view to the future. But I do sense that a January move is going to be quite difficult for him.
Thank you for that update, Ben. We had another super chat here, just a brief one that says, a question for Mr. Jacobs. Is there any truth in the rumours that Liverpool have got £250 million to spend in the summer without violating FFP? I mean, that could be true because they don't spend that much for years. That could be, but yeah, sorry, Ben, go on.
Well, I think the answer to that question isn't clear in the sense that every single Premier League club could spend 500 or 600 million, to be perfectly honest with you, in any given window and be within financial fair play. But it's not about one window. It's about projecting the spend that you will need across a cycle in financial fair play, which is multiple windows, and staying within that. So yeah, Liverpool could spend 250 million, but it's about then what is left for other windows in financial fair play. So that's why we should never isolate a window. So with Newcastle, for example, you hear Eddie Howe constantly say the club need to be respectful of financial fair play. But actually, Newcastle could spend 400 million in a window. But it is because if they qualify for Champions League, they know that they will need to spend big. So they have to weight that 400 million that they could spend across multiple windows and work out what the ratio is. And this is why trying to establish budget in any given singular window isn't a particularly useful tactic, because it's not about what Liverpool's maximum is in a singular window. It's about how they ratio their maximum across multiple windows within an FFP cycle. And if they choose to spend bigger in one window, it then affects other transfer windows. And the other thing to say is that what the number is ratioed on the books to the length of contract. So if they sign a player like Bellingham and in a very, very extreme example, give him a 10-year contract, then they can offset on the books for financial fair play purposes that transfer fee against the length of contract, which allows them more flexibility. So this is why when we predict a value specifically tied to either profit and sustainability or financial fair play, we should be very careful about focusing on the number, because we don't know who the player coming in is or what the length of contract is. It's never about the transfer fee and the payment, because on the books under financial fair play, you ratio it to the length of contract. So I think that's really important to say. And I'm always hesitant about predicting a number because of the reasons I've given.
It's impossible to do, Ben. And the reason it's almost impossible to do is unless you, and this isn't your job to do this, you don't study the financial profit and loss accounts of football clubs. You're not a financial expert. It's not what you do. And I think that's why, again, though, what you just said about offset, that's why net spend doesn't exist in the basic format that like newspapers and Sky Sports and computer games have used it in for years. Or you spent 200 million, you sold 100 million, therefore your net spend's 100 million. It doesn't work that way. In fact, the way most clubs account their books is, you're right, they spread the cost of a purchase over the length of the contract. But actually, even though you may not receive the money instantly, any sale of a player you show directly coming in. So you could spend 500 million and sell 100 million, but your books might show you as breaking even on players in and players out that year. So when people say, oh, Chelsea spent 500 million, it's got to impact FFP. That's only, and I'm sorry to sound really rude to the viewers, that's only if you're listening to idiot content creators that tell you that net spend in that basic format is real. It doesn't exist. If you know it doesn't exist, then you stop worrying about FFP, because it's generally going to be okay. Comment. Sorry, go on.
Add on that, which is that the profit and sustainability leeway to COVID adjust the losses is disappearing. And then the FFP rules changed relatively recently as of June 2022. So for those that are unaware, and I'll explain it in 30 seconds, but basically there's 3 new pillars, which in practice with legal loopholes may not mean a massive amount, but the pillars are solvency, stability, and cost control. And the new rules post-COVID allowed clubs to incur losses of 60 million euros over 3 years compared to previous allowances of 30 million euros. But the new rules now also introduce a spending cap on wages, transfers, agent fees, which are ratioed at 70% of a club's total revenue by 2025, 2026. And the feeling under these new rules is that the punishments will be more severe and consistently applied. So that last point is key with Liverpool, that if the spending cap is ratioed on wages, transfers and agents fees to 70% of the club's total revenue by 2025, 2026, then we also have to wait and see over the next season or two what a new investor in Liverpool adds and brings, both in terms of cash injection into the club, but also commercial deals and brand expansion, because that may well allow Liverpool to have more leeway under a new ownership and thus spend more in the market, which again is why I don't want to predict a summer spend, because Liverpool are in a period of transition.
Yeah, I mean, I've been talking about it for years. When I joined the department of the bank that just done a bit of lending to Arsenal, I worked in that department, and that was from day one. They would teach, like, talking to experts, and I'm not an accountant, but you just break it down simply that they always laugh when they sit there, like, as football fans, but they work in football finance. They would sit there and listen to like heavy debates on TalkSport or Sky Sports about net spend and how it's impacting, and they'd sit there chuckling, just thinking they didn't understand how this kind of fugazi way of fan accounting was created. They just don't understand it. And equally, clubs have always spent a percentage of their turnover on players. That's how clubs have always, the way the new FFP rule is working is how clubs have essentially managed their net spend forever. It's almost a case of they don't look at player out, player in that basic format. It's the entire player cost. And Alex here says that's not true, is it? Surely if you sell a player for 100 million, however, the payment terms are 120 million a year, you would have 20 million revenue. Yeah, but again, you in physical cash, yes, but you're able to declare it. And this isn't me saying it, Alex Davies. Please go back and just search on the Football Terrace, just Google net spend myth, and you'll see our video with Kieran Maguire, who is the leading financial expert in European football. He literally breaks this down in basic terms to everybody. Like, honestly, red pill yourself when it comes to net spend. The quicker you stop believing in it, the more you understand football. And equally, if you actually break it down, there's a really interesting statistic that was shared. If you look at the total spend on players, that includes wages, salaries, bonuses, agent fees, everything. From when Pep and Klopp have both been in England for the same amount, like from when Klopp arrived until now, up until the summer of 2022, there'd only been about 100 million more spent by City on total player costs than Liverpool. But net spend would show you that Liverpool spend a lot less on their players, but they spend the money elsewhere, as an example. So there's so many pitfalls to it. And I mean, I find it interesting, but maybe it's because I'm from a financial background that it's fun to me.
One thing I was going to say is that for any football fan listening who wants to understand a bit more how their club has been impacted off the back of the failed European Super League into the pandemic, should watch a very strong Apple documentary that comes out on Friday. I've had the privilege to see it a little bit early, like many other media colleagues, and I can't give specifics due to the fact that we have to be respectful of the embargo. So Friday, we will see this backstory on Apple TV of the European Super League, and it gives you an insight into a number of different clubs and their involvement. And taking away the outrage, taking away the debate over the European Super League and solely looking at it financially, there will be a better understanding once that's out there of how a lot of top clubs were impacted. And I think that feeds into this whole desire for Spurs, for investment, Manchester United, Liverpool going public, of course the Chelsea sale as well, though that was very different circumstances. But when you add everything up and then you see the context in that documentary, you will, without giving anything away, realize that a lot of elite level clubs were banking on that big cash injection, not just out of greed, but to actually survive. And that, I think, is playing into the new FFP rules, the push for change, and the search by individual clubs in the absence of that money to find new strategic investment partners or to sell outright.
Yeah, I mean, when you actually delve into the money in football, it's actually crazy when you learn stuff. Equally, just down to what they report, what players earn, it always makes me laugh that the lies in that. Especially as I used to look at their bank statements, that was my job, and you'd hear Zlatan's on 450 grand a week. No, he isn't, and I know for a fact he was just weird. I don't know where they get this information. I always remember speaking to John Smith. I don't know if you're familiar with John Smith, the super agent. He I was like, do you believe what the newspapers write about player salaries? He said if the newspapers had genuine like proof, they'd show you the proof. Like even if they had a bank statement they'd acquired, some newspapers would just show you it, because if it's been passed on to them by somebody else, they're not breaking any rules. And I'm like, yeah, well, there we go. It's the way it is. And there was one last super chat that said, very quickly, is Harry Kane's new deal connected to Kante staying?
How much is what? Sorry, you cut out.
Sorry, Kane's future depends on Conte's future.
I think they're not linked directly, but Kane will make a decision, as I understand it, based upon the project. So there's a desire to stay and extend, but because of his age and need to win silverware, he has to know the project's moving in the right direction. So you could probably argue they're linked in that respect, that if Spurs qualify for the Champions League again and go far in that tournament this season, then Harry Kane will see progress. And if that's coupled with investment at Tottenham or just spending from Daniel Levy, then he'll feel like there's been a clear step forwards. And as a consequence, he'll sign a new deal at Tottenham. And so will Antonio Conte. And similarly, if the project takes a step back, then Antonio Conte, as invested as he said he is, may not be deemed to be the right fit, and may also be frustrated, because in all likelihood, if Spurs take a step backwards, it will partially be down to a lack of consistent investment, even though Daniel Levy put down a lot of money last summer. So it's tied in that respect, because both Conte and Kane are waiting a little bit to see how the project transpires and where Spurs go this season. But I think the difference is that I'm told Spurs are very calm about the Kane situation because they believe that he wants to stay. And any talk of Bayern in particular is very premature. And obviously, with other clubs that may circle, it's further down the line. So I'm always misquoted on this because people say somehow I'm reporting that Chelsea, Manchester United want Harry Kane. It's not like that. They will take an interest in Harry Kane should he become available in the market. And of course, there's that admiration, but the fee is a challenge. And ultimately, at this stage, as Daniel Levy proved when Manchester City came calling as well, Tottenham don't really want to sell Kane to a Premier League rival. So there's a complication there as well. So it needs more time before the narrative develops. And once again, it's not that Chelsea or Manchester United are working on Kane. It's the fact that they're monitoring the situation because there may be opportunism further down the line. But right now, Kane is focused on Spurs and Spurs are focused on Kane. And with Tottenham, it's just about the fact that they're in such a key period of their season now before we really know the direction of travel. And that's why Kane's going to wait a little bit. That's why Conte's going to wait a little bit before signing. Because if he signs now, Harry Kane, unless there's a clause at the end of the season that says it's all void if we don't qualify for Champions League, he's committing to something without knowing the direction of travel. So why wouldn't he wait until the North London derby in January, followed by an away trip to Manchester City, followed by a London derby against Fulham, followed by a home game against Manchester City in early February, and then the Champions League on Valentine's Day and the return leg, of course, in March. And they've also, by the way, got home to Chelsea in the latter part of February too. So flashing forwards to the 8th of March, they'll have had key games against rivals and they'll have played both legs of their round of 16 game. And if everything goes positive on the field and Kane can play a part of that, then I would expect him to seriously engage in a renewal at Tottenham. But as you can imagine, if that period of games go against Spurs, then Harry Kane gets to mid-March and he starts thinking there's 2 months before the end of the season, what's out there? And that's when the situation will become a bit more active and a little more uncertain from Tottenham's perspective. So that does add pressure on the field, but there is a calmness that if the project is moving in the right direction, Kane's preference is to stay at Spurs. But it's such a big deal for Kane because of circumstance right now. He has to decide whether this one big renewal is about investing in Spurs or taking an opportunity elsewhere. And unlike other players at younger ages, he's not going to get another opportunity. Anything he signs now, let's say, is going to be minimum for 3 years and possibly even longer. So it's going to take him to the age of 32, 33 or beyond. And therefore, this is the last chance at 29 years of age, and he's 30 in July, to get a big deal, either at Spurs or elsewhere. If he stays at Spurs now, assuming there's no easy release clause in the short term, there'll be nobody of note coming for him at the age of 32 or 33 with the same money, with the same guarantees. Like, yes, we've seen the Lewandowskis move to Barcelona, and Kane might have that opportunity, but not to the same degree as now, where he's starting every week, where he's one, if not the highest earner, and where he is an automatic starter. And that's why this is so important for Harry Kane. So once again, there's nothing from these Premier League clubs yet, and Bayern would like Kane, but Kane wouldn't necessarily like Bayern. I think that his preference would be to stay in the Premier League, and his ultimate aim, as I'm told at the moment, which is why Spurs are calm, is to try and agree something with Tottenham, but it is contingent on the project heading in the right direction.
There we go. Ben, again, another comprehensive update. Thank you very much indeed. Viewers, I want to say a big thank you to all of you for tuning in to the show today. It means a great deal to us. Before you leave, smash the like button. If this show hits 1,000 likes, which it may do after the fact, anyone who leaves a normal comment, so not the live comments, the normal comments, your name will go into a prize draw to win £100, which will be given out to you. We're going to be doing this on a number of our shows moving forward. So make sure you come back and leave a comment after the show. Ben, always a pleasure to speak to you, my friend. Until next time, everyone, take care. Goodbye. God bless, and we'll see you soon.